Hello, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today is a journalist with theindependent.ca. She's also the program director for CHMR Radio. She has studied gender, feminist, and women's topics, and she is a trans activist. It's my pleasure to welcome Rhea Rollman to the program.
Hello, Karl. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. Now, I know that you spent most, if not all, of your grade school years here in St. John's, but can you tell me a little bit about where you were born and your growing up years, about your parents and your family?
Sure. So I was actually born in Ontario, Hamilton. But we moved here when I was very little, so before I started school. So I've essentially grown up here, spent all my life here. And yeah, my childhood was pretty normal in most regards. I had a real obsession with cats, I remember. I used to play by myself at the park or down the road, as you did in the 80s, and I would always bring home these armies of stray cats to give them homes. So I spent a lot of time talking to cats when I was growing up.
What about school? Did you enjoy school? Were you involved in lots of extracurricular activities, that sort of thing?
I did. You know, I mean, I lived for summer vacation and snow days like anyone, but I have really positive memories of school. I went to St. Andrew's Elementary, and then McPherson Junior High, and Bishop's College for high school. And, you know, I did French immersion in junior high and high school, and we had a really close-knit, you know, cohort of students. We all got along. I had lots of good friends. I was never really into sports, but it was the creative pursuits that I was more interested in. So I did a lot of creative writing and debating and public speaking. I was on the debate team. We won some provincial and national championships. So that was the sort of stuff that I was into growing up.
Now, when you were 10, you began to have these thoughts that maybe you were meant to be a girl. Can you describe for me what those thoughts were and how you were feeling at that time, age 10? So
I remember with crystal clarity the moment that I had this realization. And I mean, I think I'd had these thoughts earlier, but the moment when it kind of all came together for me, it was in grade 4, and we had a female teacher. And I remember we were having one of these just fun discussions about what do you want to be when you grow up. And I just suddenly realized that whenever when I was thinking about future careers I might be interested in, whenever I thought of myself as an adult, I could only picture myself as a woman. I couldn't picture myself as an adult grown-up man. And this really, it was really jarring. It was almost like glass shattering, in my head once I realized this, because I was so confused. And I remember the teacher, turning to me and asking, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I just said, "I want to be you." And she was flattered and thought I wanted to be a teacher. But really, I was struggling with this realization that, I only saw myself as an adult woman, and I didn't understand. It didn't make sense to me at the time. So
was it scary?
It was confusing more than anything. Mm-hmm. I knew this wasn't normal by any stretch of what we were being taught in school. I mean, we were taught nothing about gender or sexuality or anything like that back in these days. And I really kind of struggled with it. I went home, I thought about it, didn't make sense to me. I kind of knew not to talk to other people about it because this was not something that other people seemed to speak about. And I thought, well, okay, maybe it's just a weird thought you're having, shelve it, it'll go away. But it didn't, it became bigger and bigger, it lingered. And especially at that age when school activities were starting to get gendered. You know, they started splitting gym class into boys and girls, and so many of our activities were increasingly gendered. And you have students who start going through puberty, and increasingly, I felt that I was on the wrong side of that divide. You know, and this really confused me, and I didn't know what to think of it.
Do you remember when you found out that it was possible for people to change their gender? And did the fact that you were in St. John's, Newfoundland, and not Montreal or Toronto, kind of dampen your enthusiasm, for want of a better word, for the idea?
Yeah. You know, again, I think it's important to remember this was, you know, the 80s
Yes.
and the 90s, and things are so different then. You know, I go to elementary schools today, and, you know, kids talk about, you know, gender identity, and it's wonderful. But back then, there was no education about any of this. It wasn't spoken of. I think the first time I realized that this was something beyond just a thought in my head, I came across a newspaper. You know, my parents left the newspaper lying around, and I came across an article one day. It was in elementary school around this time, and it was about, I think, a trans tennis star, and it kind of briefly encapsulated the story of her life and her coming out and transitioning. And so this was the first time I had any inkling that, oh, you know, this is something that exists in the world. There's other people besides me who seem to have this experience. And, you know, it helped provide clarity. It was also quite terrifying, because I realized it wasn't just some random weird thought that was going to go away eventually. So that's the first time I realized this. You know, the internet was not really around at the time.
No.
It existed, but not in the form it is today. Very few people used it, and there was no social media like today. I spent a lot of time in the library, so I, you know, hunted out encyclopedias and was able to put together bits and pieces of what trans identity was all about. And then I was actually one of, I think, the early people who started using the internet here. There was a cohort of us who were online, and we all knew each other in the city, you know. And once I was able to go online, I came across, you know, accounts from other cities, other countries, people talking about their experiences transitioning, trying to access hormones and surgery. So this really opened up a whole new door, and I was able to understand, you know, my own experience a lot more and start to get a sense of what options were out there and how other people were dealing with this stuff.
Yeah, and I can't imagine that there were that many out trans people in St. John's when you were younger. So you really didn't have anybody who was going through what you were going through, or who had gone through what you were going through to talk to, right?
No, I mean, I didn't know anyone. You know, I was in school. There was, again, no information in school.
You must have had a yearning
this.
to speak to somebody.
I did, and well, actually, I don't know if I would have, because I was so freaked out by this that, you know, it seemed very paramount in my mind that this was something not to let other people know about, you know, to try to hide this strange struggle that I was increasingly having. I came, you know, the internet helped a lot, because there were so many accounts that people put out there. This is my experience, this is what I'm going through. And so just reading those accounts of people in other places helped immensely. And it was hard being in Newfoundland, because, you know, these were people living in Toronto, in American cities, you know, Vancouver, and they were having a really tough time of trying to access supports. Here in Newfoundland, you just felt, you know, like you were off the edge of the world. You were so far away.
I mean, I was going to ask you why you put off transitioning, because you only transitioned since, well, really the beginning of the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So you waited a while to do this, and I'm just wondering why you waited so long. I assume it's because the supports weren't there.
That's basically it, I think. You know, and there were a few reasons. I remember in grade 6, we had a really homophobic teacher and transphobic teacher who, you know, he would just sometimes break off the lesson plan and just start going into rants about gay people and trans people, very angry.
In the Newfoundland school system?
Yeah, yeah.
In grade 6?
In grade 6, yeah. And, you know, it was upsetting. I mean, we were just kids. We didn't really understand what he was talking about.
I'm blown away. I'm actually appalled to hear that.
Yeah, it was frightening. And like I said, we didn't really understand a lot of what he was talking about, but we knew that, okay, this man is angry. You know, this is like hate coming from this man.
This man should have been fired.
Yeah, but, you know, no one thought or acted like it was unusual. And so that really, you know, I mean, we kind of knew that, okay, no one should be this angry about other human beings, but it really underscored this need to kind of not tell other people. And in my own case, you know, I thought very seriously about coming out and transitioning. When I was in high school, I really wrestled with that decision. I wanted to. I dreamt about it, but reading the accounts of people who were doing this, you know, this was the early 90s. Trans healthcare was in the medieval ages, really. You know, people in Toronto, for example, they had to go before boards of psychiatrists. They had to prove that they were trans. There were these weird rules about, you know, living in an outwardly presenting the gender you're transitioning to before you would even be approved for hormones or surgery. You had to do that for years, which meant you had to act out this very caricatured, stereotyped version of femininity for trans women. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it was just, there were no human rights protections, so trans people were being, you know, fired right and left from jobs when they came out. I mean, a lot of that still goes on, but at least there are now...
Human rights protection here was granted about 7 years ago.
That's correct.
And medical support, some medical support a couple of years ago, I guess.
Yeah, the medical supports have grown. About 2 years ago, the MCP policy was overhauled to provide additional supports and to try to make things a bit more accessible.
Did you, before you started your transition, were there times when you felt like you were, in a sense, pretending to be a man?
That's a really, I think, apt way of putting it. You know, I think when you grow up experiencing, you know, gender dysphoria, and you grow up as a trans identity, you really get a clear sense of how gender roles are, you know, are socially constructed. You know, and yeah, you really felt like you were, in my case, felt like I was performing masculinity. It was all an act. And I think you become very good at performing it, you know, because you're very concerned that other people perceive you in this way. So yeah, you know, and it's ironic, you know, as I got older, you know, people would say, oh, you've got such a healthy version of masculinity. I'd be asked to speak about healthy masculinities, you know, or serve on committees dealing with that. And on the one hand, it was flattering, but on the other, it was very painful because, you know, I felt I couldn't explain to people, you've got it all wrong, you know, it's all just an act.
Did that lead to mental health issues, depression?
Yeah, I wrestled with that. You know, every few years I would come very close to wanting to come out and transitioning, and I would get very depressed about this, you know, about not being out. And I think it also made it really difficult to have authentic relationships with people. You know, when you're constantly acting, when you're constantly concerned about having this big private side of yourself that you can't share with anyone, it makes it hard to really engage honestly with people. You know, you feel everything is kind of an act. And I think that's how I felt. You know, I had very positive social relationships. You know, I was fairly popular, I think, but, you know, I didn't really feel like I was connecting authentically with people around me.
So what was it that finally made you decide, this is the time, now I have to do it?
Well, like I said, you know, I would struggle with this every few years, and it's ironic, you know, growing up there were no supports, nothing in the healthcare system or the education system, no human rights protections, and all of this, you know, I decided I didn't want the hassle of, I didn't want my entire life to be arguing with psychiatrists, and so I decided not, I continually made the decision not to come out. And then in more recent years, when human rights protections started coming in, when the healthcare system started improving trans healthcare, I started, I thought again about coming out, but then I told myself, nah, you're too old. Hormones are less effective the older you get, surgeries become more complicated, you're ensconced in professional relationships and you don't know what will happen to those if you transition. So I would convince myself, too late. It was a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I was reading an article, I think it was published in Vice, and it was an article about older people transitioning. And I'm so glad that this article was written because it just floored me. And these were interviews with folks who were way older than me, people in their 50s and 60s. There was a trans woman in her 80s who transitioned in her 80s, surgical transition too, I believe. And I was just amazed because I realized two things. First of all, these people, reading these people talk about how positive their lives became after they transitioned, I realized that, wow, okay, it can still make a big difference in your life no matter how old you are, being able to come out and live authentically. It just improved their lives, and I realized there's no real age limit on that. And the other thing I realized, I had always kind of hoped, I guess, that if I just ignored this, it would eventually go away and I'd stop wrestling with this. But that doesn't happen, and reading about people in their 70s and 80s transitioning, I realized it was never going away. I was gonna always be dealing with this. And I didn't want to be, in my 60s looking back thinking, gosh, you could have transitioned decades ago. Why didn't you? So by the time I finished reading that article, I think I had kind of subconsciously decided, okay, you've got to do this.
Who was the first person you told?
I told my partner at the time first. We'd had numerous discussions about gender and sexuality, and so I had a pretty good sense that they would be okay with me coming out. It was still scary, very scary, to articulate this thing that you've been, feeling for so many years, and that you have kept private and secret. But I told them, and like I had hoped, their response was just so positive, enthusiastic. They were amazing. So that went beautifully.
What about your parents, your family, your friends?
Yeah, that came later. I gradually increased the pool of people who I told once I had started medically transitioning and stuff, and that went well too. I was surprised. I thought before coming out that I worried about regretting it. Because once you let this out and once you share this, you can't really take it back. And so I worried that I would regret telling people, but I never did. I just felt this immense sense of freedom and liberation.
Coming out for LGBTQ people can be, sometimes it can be a very positive experience, and other times it can be not so positive, and there are dreadful consequences in some instances. And you need emotional support. And you get that emotional support quite often from our community, the LGBTQ community. Was that the case for you?
There are wonderful supports here, absolutely. It was a weird time to be transitioning because I really kicked into my transition. The pandemic began shortly after I had come out. And so you realize how much of your identity is the product of how people perceive you. And when you're not talking to people, not seeing people, it's how do you transition? So it was a weird time transitioning during the pandemic. But there are, there's great local organizations now. Trans Support NL is a wonderful group. They've got support groups for all age levels in all different parts of the province. There's, Quadrangle, which is working toward a queer community center. There's, all kinds of organizations popping up, and they provide wonderful supports. The internet was really big as well. The internet is a fraught place to be when you're trans or queer. There's a lot of hate you can experience there, so you really have to be careful. But there's immense support, and there's huge communities there. So connecting with people online, people who were going through the exact same moment of transition that I was really helpful. And having that support network, seeing how people are navigating these things in other parts of the country or other parts of the world really helps broaden your perspectives and is an immense support.
I'm assuming that one of the first things you had to access was hormone therapy. Was that relatively easy for you to do, or?
I was really lucky, It's interesting because once I came out, and I hear this experience from other trans people too, once I came out, my gender dysphoria became really intense. And I felt this urgent need to do something about it, And so I needed to start accessing hormones and start working towards surgery. Every country, is different, and in some countries there are it's horribly difficult to access hormones. You have waiting lists that are years long in order to access trans healthcare, and that is, really difficult. It's every week pretty much, I read about, people, often young people who, came out and then were told it'll be another 10 years before you can access, hormones. And it costs lives because people need these supports as soon as they can access them. In Canada, things are a lot better than in a lot of other countries. There are still huge problems and gaps, but Canada is, definitely one of the better countries. So in my case, I was lucky to have a family doctor. I didn't feel comfortable going to my family doctor though, because I was always dealing with these very heterocentric, ciscentric, male medical residents. I didn't get any sense of diversity or inclusion, from the clinic, and so I didn't really feel safe coming out there. I didn't know where to go. My partner had worked at Planned Parenthood, suggested I call them because my partner remembered trans people going to Planned Parenthood. So I did. I called them. They were wonderfully supportive. Their services are hugely in demand, so there's often waiting lists. They told me they could connect me with a doctor, but it would be about 6 weeks. And even 6 weeks seemed like an eternity, it was so painful. But I made the appointment. And then they called back a few minutes later, and I'm glad I answered the phone because it was an unlisted number. But they explained that, just so you know, our doctors cannot, they can renew hormone prescriptions, but they can't actually start you on the path. They can't initially provide that diagnosis. And so they directed me to Dr. Sinnott, Dr. Mary Lynn Sinnott, who's probably the trans healthcare expert in this province. So she had a clinic on a Friday, I remember. I called her office. The assistant, Jacinta, answered, just so wonderful, warm and supportive. And she said, well, okay, you come in first thing Monday morning and we'll take care of you. And I literally cried because, the thought of being able to, meet the doctor just 2 days away was
And
massive.
after you were on the hormones, did you feel different mentally?
Yeah. I think part of it was just the psychological knowledge I was doing something about this finally. That was certainly a relief. But there's something more to it as well, the hormones, the physical changes. Before I started, I sometimes worried that, what if I regret this? What if I am weirded out by this? So I was very afraid. But once I started them, it felt so natural. It felt right, as your body starts changing and you start taking hormones. It felt like I was finally writing things. I was that I was feeling comfortable in my body for the first time ever, really. And that was a really remarkable thing to experience.
Now, expressing yourself as a woman is a process as well. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know, it's been immensely rewarding, but challenging too, because I think, you know, if you go through this puberty in your teenage years, you know, most people, you know, you have years to figure out who you are, you know, what your personality is like, your style, you know. You've got years as a teenager to trial and error, you know, to discover yourself, to change how you present yourself. But, you know, when you transition later in life, there's almost a social expectation that, you know, overnight you can suddenly appear in a different role from that in which people are familiar with you. And that can be daunting, you know. I felt authentic and real and natural for the first time ever, but also, you know, simple things like figuring out what clothing styles you wear, or, you know, how to present yourself to others, you know, could be kind of challenging. And amidst all that, you're also dealing with people's external reactions, you know, and some people are great, other people they might be misgendering you, especially early on in transition. And so dealing with that experience can be really, it can be a lot, you know, to go through all at once in this very truncated period of time.
Rhea, we've run out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming on the program. I know you were a little bit nervous about doing this interview, and you did a great job, and I really appreciate what you've had to say to us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of Karl Wells Point to Point. We'll see you again next time.